Hi everybody, it's Dr. Hall carrying on with the second part of lecture 31, so part 2B now for the digestive system. Last time we talked about the liver and the gallbladder, so you'll recall that the liver is kind of like a sewage treatment plant in many ways. It removes and processes wastes and toxins from our bloodstream for us, so alcohol, acetaminophen, lots of other things. It also regulates glucose by putting extra glucose, hooking them all together into glycogen and storing them in the liver, and then when you need it, breaking those apart into glucose and releasing it into the bloodstream. It produces important proteins. We talked specifically about albumin, which is important for maintaining osmotic pressure in the bloodstream, and fibrinogen, which is important for clotting. The liver also produces, does not store, but produces bile, which is an important emulsifier to break lipids into smaller droplets so they can be digested. The liver also regulates cholesterol, produces urea from waste so that we can then excrete it with our kidneys, stores iron, and also stores the vitamins A, D, E, and K. The liver's sidekick is the gallbladder, and the gallbladder is a storage pouch that stores up bile produced by the liver for when you need a big dose of it, which would be when you eat a fatty meal. Okay, so now we're going to move on into the intestines. So our first case is Sylvia. Sylvia here has been trying to lose weight but isn't having luck with diet and exercise like most people. So she decides to start taking Ally, which is the generic name is Orlistat, which is an over-the-counter weight loss medication that you can take. Unfortunately, she gets some significant side effects, so excessive flatulence, really oily stools, and occasional fecal leakage, right? So not being able to control her stool. So she asked the nurse practitioner at Student Health why this is happening, and she's told it has to do with her small intestine. So we're going to use Sylvia's case to explore the small intestine and what happens there. So the small intestine is a very long, right, about 30 feet long, coiled tube, muscular tube. It has that outer longitudinal and inner circular muscular layers, just like the esophagus, that's going to extend from the stomach to the large intestine. The first part of the small intestine is pretty small. It's just this part right here, and that's called the duodenum. And you might remember that sitting right here is the pancreas. All right, so the first part is the duodenum, and then the next part here is the jejunum, and then the last part is the ileum, which is then going to lead into the large intestine. So duodenum, jejunum, ileum. So the small intestine is going to do both digestion and absorption for us. And in order to facilitate those two things, we need a lot of surface area in the intestine. So not only is the intestine very long, but it also has additional features that increase its surface area. So first of all, the inner wall of the small intestine is heaped up into these folds, these large circular folds, which are sometimes called the plica circularis. So first of all, the inner wall is all folded, kind of like rugae, but a little bit different because the purpose here is for surface area, not to allow it to expand. And then if you look, see they've zoomed in here with a little square. You can see that these folds are covered with these teeny tiny little finger-like projections, and those teeny tiny little finger-like projections they've magnified here are called villi, V-I-L-L-I. And so you have these tiny finger-like projections kind of coming up and over on those folds, further increasing surface area. And then, so we have another tiny box here that we're going to magnify up. If you look at the cells that line the surface of a villus, which is the singular of villi, they are simple columnar epithelium. And the surface, the apical surface, the surface that's in the lumen or the inside of the intestine, has these little tiny finger-like projections on top of the cell itself. And those are called microvilli. You might remember that from way back at the beginning of the semester when we learned about parts of the cell. So the small intestine is not only really long, it has these circular folds, and then on top of those circular folds there are little tiny finger-like projections called villi. And then all of the simple columnar epithelial cells on those villi have microvilli on the tops of them. So all of these things work together to massively increase the surface area of the small intestine. So if we look at this under the microscope, so what we're seeing here, this is a villus. This is a villus that kind of got folded around itself when they made the slide. This is another villus, also kind of got folded. And so when we look at the outer surface of each villus, and if we zoom in, we can see, look, it's our old friend, simple columnar epithelium. We can also see this little fringy stuff on the very surface of the cells. Those are the microvilli. And we can also see our old friend, the goblet cells, which are producing mucus. So the small intestine also has goblet cells to produce mucus to ease the passage of the chyme of the food and digestive juices through the small intestine, but not nearly as many goblet cells as we saw in the stomach, right? You remember the stomach was specialized to make lots of mucus to form a protective layer so that the hydrochloric acid produced in the stomach doesn't damage the epithelium. So simple columnar epithelium lining each individual villus, right? That's an individual villus. And the interior of the villus, we have a capillary, and we also have something called a lacteal, which is part of the lymphatic system. So we're going to talk about those in more detail pretty shortly. So what does the small intestine do? So first of all, it is going to perform digestion. Remember, digestion is breaking down food products, and it's going to do chemical digestion specifically. So it's going to use enzymes to break down molecules into smaller molecules. So we have the enzymes from the pancreas, which you might recall are amylase for carbohydrates, lipase for lipids, trypsin for proteins, and nuclease for nucleic acids. So those enzymes all get secreted into the duodenum, mixed with the chyme, so that then as the food is traveling through, as the chyme is traveling through the small intestine, it's being mixed with all of these enzymes. We also have additional enzymes located on the microvilli, which is often called the brush border because it almost looks like a little bit of a hairbrush there. And so we have additional enzymes there called brush border enzymes. So the small intestine is well stocked with enzymes from the pancreas that are secreted into the duodenum, as well as brush border enzymes that are located on the microvilli of those simple columnar epithelial cells. So just to remind you, proteins are going to get broken down into smaller strings of amino acids and then eventually down into plain amino acids. Our complex carbohydrates, or starches, which are also called polysaccharides, I apologize, we have so many different words that we use to describe them, are going to get broken down into simple carbohydrates, right? So glucose and other simple sugars, which we call monosaccharides and disaccharides. And then lipids are going to get broken down into fatty acids. Those are their subunits. So after the small intestine digests the chemicals, right, after we get down to the place of having amino acids, monosaccharides, or glucose, right? Now we need to absorb them. So here's where the money is, right? So now we're going to actually pull these nutrients into our body. So these subunits, glucose, amino acids, are now small enough, right? So here they're showing you these are individual amino acids. They're now small enough, we've broken down things enough that they can enter the epithelial cell, that simple columnar cell that lines the outside of the villus of the small intestine. It's then going to move across the cell to the other side to then enter the interior of the villus. And amino acids and monosaccharides like glucose are going to move into the capillary that is inside the villus. Lipids are going to be a little bit different. So this capillary then, remember it's in the small intestine. So it's going to drain into the veins of the small intestine, which will eventually drain into the superior mesenteric vein, which drains into the hepatic portal vein, and then out into capillaries of the liver, where then the glucose will be packaged into glycogen for storage, amino acids will be processed into proteins that are needed, right? And then the blood will then drain into the hepatic veins and into the inferior vena cava. One other thing that this diagram is showing you is that we have both pancreatic enzymes and brush border enzymes. Sorry, I meant to highlight that. Okay. So the small intestine is where almost all of our nutrient absorption takes place. You cannot really live without a small intestine unless we just feed you intravenously, which doesn't work long term. So the small intestine is super important, and both our amino acids and glucose and other monosaccharides are going to move across the simple columnar epithelium into this capillary inside the villus, right? Which is then going to go into the superior mesenteric vein, hepatic portal vein, liver, hepatic veins, inferior vena cava, general circulation. So you can see I kind of posted some of these little pictures of those simple columnar epithelial cells because they didn't draw them here. Oh, that's terrible. Okay. Lipids, however, are a little bit different, so we're going to talk about that separately. So let's just review. So carbohydrates, most of them get broken down into glucose. That is their basic subunit. The glucose molecule is then absorbed into the epithelial cell, which is sometimes also called the enterocyte. And then it's going to move through the base of that cell into the villus that is inside, or in the capillary, which is inside the villus, and then that blood is going to drain through the veins, superior mesenteric vein, hepatic portal vein, liver. Amino acids, right? So proteins get broken down into polypeptides, get broken down into peptides, get broken down into amino acids. Same thing. They get absorbed into the enterocyte, absorbed into the epithelial cell, move into the interior of the villus, into the capillary, and then into the bloodstream. Now, lipids are different. So I'm going to talk you through this diagram. So first of all, you'll remember we start off with large lipid droplets. Then we're going to secrete our bile from the gallbladder down through the cystic duct, the common bile duct, into the duodenum, right? That bile, those bile salts are going to then attach to the lipid and emulsify it, so break it into smaller droplets. Then once it's in those smaller droplets, pancreatic lipase can do its work. So what we're going to end up with then is the fatty acids, which are the subunits of lipids, surrounded by this coat, this shell of bile salts. Okay, so that's what we're going to end up with in the lumen of the small intestine. This structure of fatty acids on the inside with bile salts all around the outside is called a micelle. And you might wonder, why do we have to go through all this trouble? And the answer is because lipids are not water soluble, and this is an aqueous environment. This is a water-based solution, chyme. So you need to have a chaperone, basically. You need to have some type of an emulsifier, something to allow you to handle this lipid soluble, this non-polar molecule. So we have a micelle, which is the bile salts around the fatty acids that we have emulsified and digested with our lipase, emulsified with bile salts and digested with our lipase. That then is going to move to the surface of our intestinal cell, our enterocyte, and you might remember that nonpolar things can move across a plasma membrane easily, right? So the fatty acids or triglycerides are then just going to move right into the cell, no problem. But once they get to the interior of the cell, again, the cytoplasm is a water-based thing, so you need a chaperone. So some proteins are going to surround that triglyceride, those fatty acids. And so this new combination of fatty acid plus its protein coat is called a chylomicron. So first, with our first chaperone inside the lumen of the intestine, we were a micelle, right? And now inside the intestinal cell, we have a new chaperone of a protein coat, and that's called the chylomicron, that combination. The chylomicron is then going to be released from the intestinal cell via exocytosis. Remember, that's how we get big things out of a cell. And then, because it's special and different, that chylomicron is not going to go directly into the bloodstream, into the capillary inside the villus. Instead, it's going to go into the lacteal. And the lacteal is a lymphatic vessel. And you might remember the lymphatic system is kind of the poor cousin to the circulatory system. It drains fluid from our body tissues. And so this lacteal, this very tiny lymphatic vessel in the villus, is going to drain into larger lymphatic vessels in the intestines, and then up through the lymphatic system, and eventually it's going to be drained into the bloodstream in the area of the subclavian and internal jugular veins. So that's how the lymphatic system works. It's kind of strange. So absorption of lipids is completely different because they are lipids and they are not water soluble. So they must be emulsified by bile salts so that the lipase can break them down into fatty acids, and then they must have chaperones. So inside the lumen of the intestines, they have bile salts that act as a chaperone, and that unit is then called a micelle. And the interior of the intestinal epithelial cell, or enterocyte, they are surrounded by special proteins, and that unit is called a chylomicron, and then that chylomicron is going to move into the lacteal inside the villus. The other thing I want to say about lipids is you might recall those fat-soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, E, and K. They are absorbed along with fatty acids in this same way, which is one of the reasons why if you are taking those vitamins or if you want to absorb those vitamins, you have to be sure that you are also ingesting lipids because they hitchhike with them. Okay, so this is the text that explains all of what we just talked about on that last image. So if you didn't get everything down, then you might want to pause the video here and fill in your notes. So remember Sylvia? We talked about her a really long time ago. So the problem with Sylvia is her small intestine is pretty sad. The way Ally or orlistat works is it actually blocks lipase, which is the enzyme that we need to break down lipids into fatty acids. So we can't break them down into their subunits, which means we can't absorb them because then they're too large. So that's how this works to help people lose weight, is you can't absorb these calories in the fats that you've eaten because you can't absorb these fatty acids. But that also means that these fats then stay in the inside of the intestines because they can't get broken down and absorbed, and that's what makes your stool really oily and greasy and makes it harder to control and to be continent of, right? So it's common for people to have some accidents if they are taking this medicine at the recommended doses, because if the medicine is working, then your stools are going to be really greasy. So this is a summary of what happens to carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids in our entire digestive system. So I want to point out a few things for you. Let's start with carbohydrates here. So you'll recall that the salivary glands make amylase, which starts breaking down carbohydrates. So the chemical digestion of carbohydrates starts in the mouth. There is no chemical digestion of carbohydrates in the stomach, just mechanical. Then when we get down into the duodenum, we receive amylase from the pancreas that gets squirted into the duodenum. So we resume chemical digestion of carbohydrates. And then when we are traveling through the small intestine, there are also additional enzymes present on the brush border of those epithelial cells. So we end up with our monosaccharides like glucose, which are then absorbed. Proteins, I'm going to do those next. There's really not any significant chemical digestion of proteins in the mouth, certainly none that I want you to know about for this course. But in the stomach, remember, the stomach makes pepsin, which is an enzyme to begin the digestion of proteins. Remember also, pepsin requires a low pH to be activated, which is one of the reasons that our stomach produces hydrochloric acid. Then when we move into the duodenum, we are getting trypsin and some other enzymes from the pancreas that break down proteins. And as we move further into the small intestine, there are also additional enzymes present on the brush border to help break down those peptides into amino acids. So we have chemical digestion of proteins happening in the stomach as well as the small intestine. Lipids. Not any significant chemical digestion until we end up down in the small intestine, and that's where we receive the bile and the lipase, right? And so those two things together are going to break down the lipids into fatty acids, which are going to be surrounded by bile salts as micelles, and then the fatty acid will then move into the intestinal epithelial cell. Small intestine, super duper important. So let's talk about Simon. He has celiac disease. Now, celiac disease, actual diagnosed celiac disease, which is different sometimes from gluten intolerance. So celiac disease is an allergy to gluten, which is a protein found in wheat, as well as barley and rye and some other grains. And so if Simon eats gluten, he gets abdominal pain and diarrhea. And the reason why this happens is you get damage to the small intestine and a loss of surface area and normal function. So this is an example of what that looks like. So in celiac disease, the immune cells attack gluten inside the cells and the villi and eventually cause destruction of the villi. So if you look at a normal small intestine, this is a villus, right? And where I'm kind of drawing with the green, that's a whole continuous layer of simple columnar epithelial cells, right? So we have all these nice long skinny villi, which give us lots of surface area. But in somebody with celiac disease, what happens is those villi get just blunted and truncated because there's so much inflammation going on. So they lose surface area. They also lose brush border enzymes, right? If you have fewer simple columnar cells with microvilli that have those brush border enzymes located on them, you also, so not only do you have less surface area to absorb nutrients, you also have fewer enzymes to help break down and chemically digest those nutrients. So normally the inside of the small intestine looks like this, nice velvety texture because of those villi, and you can also see those circular folds. Someone who's really ill with celiac disease, this is what their small intestine looks like. It's very unhealthy, it's inflamed, it's all flattened. Terrible, terrible. Right? So this will cause abdominal pain and diarrhea and can also cause malnutrition. So people with untreated celiac disease who are eating gluten often become deficient in many nutrients and vitamins. It can be very problematic. The really cool thing about celiac disease, there aren't many cool things about it, but the cool thing is that if you stop eating gluten, this process will reverse and the intestines can completely heal and normalize and return to normal function, which is amazing. But we also know that people who have celiac disease have to follow a gluten-free diet, a completely gluten-free diet for the rest of their lives. Even a little bit of cheating can cause this inflammation again, which not only causes symptoms and problems with absorption of nutrients, but can also increase your risk of small intestinal cancers over your lifetime. So now we're going to move out of the small intestine into the large intestine. We're going to talk about Laura. So she's just moved to Wisconsin and she loves the cheese here. But ever since she came to Stout, she's noticed that her bowel movements are a lot less regular. She doesn't go as frequently, she feels backed up, and sometimes when she does go poop, she passes large, hard stools that are really kind of difficult to move out. And so she wonders if it's just that she's embarrassed to go to the bathroom in the dorm restroom, or if it has to do with her food choices. So she goes to see the dietitian and is told the problem has to do with her large intestine. So this is our intro to thinking about the large intestine. So the large intestine is this big upside down U-shaped tube with a squiggle at the end. So here was our ileum, the last part of our small intestine, and we have an ileocecal junction because this first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. This here is the appendix. The digested food will then move up this way, so this is called the ascending colon, across through the transverse colon, down through the descending colon, then through the sigmoid colon, and into the rectum. And once it moves into the rectum, you will say, I think I need to go to the bathroom. And if it's an acceptable time and you get up and you go to the bathroom, then these contents will move out through the anus. If it's not an acceptable time, you will say, not now. And the large intestine is actually pretty cool in that what it will do is if it arrives in the rectum and you're like, now is not a good time, you can actually do reverse peristalsis, and the stool will be moved back up out of the rectum for a bit of time for you so that you don't have that uncomfortable feeling. So what does the large intestine do other than move stool? Well, it absorbs water. So in the typical day, about 1,500 cc's of material get delivered to the large intestine, and yet in a typical day, we only excrete about 500 cc's worth of stool. So there is a lot of water in those contents that are first delivered to the cecum, that first part of the large intestine. So we're going to absorb a lot of water out of those intestinal contents. So that helps us to not lose water, right, to maintain our fluid balance. And it also creates nice formed solid stool for us. Yay, right? Otherwise we would have diarrhea all of the time, which is harder to be continent of. Now the other thing that the large intestine does, which is really pretty amazing, is that it houses bacteria in it that we call intestinal flora. These are normal, healthy bacteria, and they feed off of the intestinal contents that are foods and things that we don't digest because we don't have the enzymes to break them down. But these bacteria do, and so it's a really happy place for them to live. So these bacteria collectively are referred to as the microbiome, and they are all these organisms that live within us, and it turns out that they actually are really important for our health. They assist with our digestion, so they actually do break some molecules down into smaller subunits that we then do absorb. They also create vitamins for us. So actually a good portion of our B complex vitamins and about 50% of our vitamin K is actually produced by our bacteria in our colon, which is pretty amazing. The other half of it we eat, right? But we can't eat enough vitamin K to meet our own needs, so we're really lucky to have these bacteria to do that for us. Vitamin K is important for blood clotting. We're also learning a lot of new things about the microbiome, about its functions for metabolism, nervous system function. We're also learning a lot about its immune system functions in terms of regulating our inflammation in our body and propensity toward autoimmune diseases. There's a lot of evidence mounting that it's important in mood, and it's really fascinating area of study that has just exploded in the last 10 years. So if you're interested, just Google search microbiome. You'll find all kinds of interesting things. All right, so the other thing that it does, right, is control the passage of stool through that process of peristalsis. So again, we have an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer of muscles in the colon or large intestine. And we also have, see this little line here? These are called Tinea coli, and these are also additional muscles that run the length of the large intestine, and they kind of pooch it up into these little pouch-like areas called haustra. So we have some additional muscles to kind of help scooch things through. So defecation is the process of eliminating things that are inside our large intestine and getting them out of our body. And as I mentioned earlier, when stool first moves into the rectum, it triggers a reflex opening of the internal sphincter, and that's when you have that sensation of, oh, I need to go. You can either then decide to go and relax your external sphincter, which is under voluntary control, or you can hold it and say, nope, I'm not going to open my external sphincter, in which case we will have reverse peristalsis that will move the stool back up out of the rectum into the sigmoid colon for a little bit. All right, so what's happening with Laura? Well, you can get really shy about pooping around other people, right? So that can make you kind of delay your defecation reflex, right? And be like, not now, there's somebody else in the bathroom. So then your stool is going to go back up into the sigmoid. And the longer the stool spends in the large intestine, the more water we absorb out of it. So the more time it spends in there, the drier and harder it gets. The longer it stays there, the worse it gets. Laura was also eating a lot of cheese, which tends to be constipating, and not a lot of fiber, right? Whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. So that dietary fiber is really important for a couple of reasons. One is it keeps some water in the stool because it is osmotically active. The other thing is it adds some bulk and can make it easier for the large intestine to push stool through. So dietary fiber can be really important for staying regular. Also, cheese just tends to be constipating, as do bananas. So poor Laura is just constipated. She needs to eat more fiber and drink more fluids. All right, what about Colin? So Colin recently had a bad skin infection, and he had to be on some antibiotics for many weeks. And then he developed crampy abdominal pain and some really foul-smelling diarrhea. So why do you think this would happen? So the clue here is that he was treated with antibiotics. What do antibiotics do? Well, they kill bacteria. We need bacteria in our large intestine, right? So if you take antibiotics for a long time, and if it kills off enough of the bacteria in your large intestine, that interferes with your ability to digest things normally, right? And your large intestine can't work properly. So abdominal pain and diarrhea is a common side effect from antibiotic use because of how antibiotics work. It's what we would expect to have happen. If it gets really severe, you need to let your doctor know, because there is a weird one that can cause really severe illness if it occurs. All right, let's talk about Abby. So she gets appendicitis, which is infection or inflammation of the appendix, and had to have surgery to get it removed. And now she wonders, well, is this going to hurt me later on in life? Like, can you live without an appendix? Is this a problem to not have one anymore? So you'll recall the appendix is this little tiny tubular structure that hangs off of the cecum, and it can get infected because sometimes some stool contents get lodged in there and block it off, and it gets infected and inflamed, and you can get really sick from it. We're not really sure what the appendix does or why we still have one. People live just fine without it. One of the current hypotheses is that the appendix, because it's kind of this little off to the side thing, might serve as a reservoir for some normal intestinal flora, those healthy bacteria, that if you do have an illness or take antibiotics or something else that tends to wipe out the bacteria inside your large intestine, maybe because it's kind of off to the side, this little small thing, maybe some of the bacteria in the appendix will still survive and then can repopulate the rest of the large intestine. That's kind of a hypothesis. We don't have a lot of evidence to support it, so we don't really know. Maybe. All right, so in the second half of lecture 31, we've talked about the small intestine, the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum that has not forks but folds, villi and microvilli to increase its surface area to enhance its ability to absorb nutrients. We have both enzymes from the pancreas and the brush border, otherwise known as the microvilli, for all molecule types. And so our monosaccharides like glucose and our amino acids, those smallest subunits from carbohydrates and proteins, can move across the enterocyte, that intestinal epithelial cell, which is a simple columnar epithelial cell, and into the capillary that's inside the villus. Lipids are different because they're not water soluble, so we need bile to emulsify them. And so once the lipid is broken into smaller droplets surrounded by bile salts, we call those micelles. And the lipase can then act on the lipid and break it down into fatty acids. Those fatty acids will then enter the enterocyte, where they're surrounded by proteins to form a new structure, a chylomicron, that then exits the enterocyte into the villus side via exocytosis and enters the lacteal, again another typo, lacteal, E-A-L, in the villus and travels through the lymphatic system to eventually drain back into the bloodstream. We then talked about the large intestine, whose main function is to absorb water from the stool contents, and it also happens to house bacteria that carry out important digestive functions, as well as producing vitamins for us and probably regulating many other systems of the body. So we've now gone through the entire digestive system from mouth to anus and all of the functions that are happening within. In lecture 32, we'll take a look at the digestive system from the perspective of nutrients specifically. So it'll be a more nutrition-focused lecture. That's it for now.